My name is Kehinde Andrews. I am Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and the Chair of the Harambee Organisation of Black Unity. Welcome to my exp. The only real way to understand what's happening now is to put it in its historical context. I guess Africa is a perfect place to start with this. There's a really excellent book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And if you look at Africa today, particularly so-called sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest part of the world, why? The question here is why. Now, what's often put forward is its corruption. It isn't quite as advanced. It isn't as technological. But again, why? And you have to have the historical understanding for this. Africa is first underdeveloped through slavery. I mean, slavery takes out tens of millions of people, potentially up to 100 million people who are either murdered or taken out. The lower estimate is 40 million. The top estimate is 100 million. Drained out resource-wise. That completely shatters the political economy of Africa, which was ahead of the political economy of Europe at the time when Europeans came in. After slavery, it's not like it's all good because Africa is so depleted. This is why Europe can take over. Europe then goes in, colonizes, drains the resources out. The whole continent literally just carved up by different European powers who were just draining out all of the resources. And then even when independence happened, you still have this economic neocolonialism. So it is the same companies today. Companies like Cadbury's, for example, that own the cocoa fields in Ghana, the tire rubber companies in Congo, they're still foreign owned, right? So they're still draining out all the resources. So you can't understand the poverty in Africa without understanding that historical piece and how it still carries on today. The West is rich because the rest is poor. And that's because this underdevelopment, this impoverishment, that is what has produced the wealth of the West. Going all the ways you think about slavery in the first instance, you think about colonialism. It is this, you think about India is a perfect example where India is so much more advanced than Britain in like the 15th century. The Britain can't even consider colonizing India. India's textiles, 25% of world exports of cotton at this time. But essentially what happens is the UK, Britain, well, England at the time, takes lots and lots of wealth through slavery and other ways and is enriching itself and unveils itself into India. And then eventually manages to get its claws into India and then deindustrialize India at a rate where by the end of British colonialism in India, India's gone from 25% of cotton production to 2% of cotton production, and the cotton's being produced where? In the United Kingdom. So what's happening is Britain is purposely deindustrializing India so it can grow. And you can say the same argument about the British Empire in Africa, purposely taking out wealth so that it can grow. And this is what makes Britain, which is a very small, generally insignificant country in the North Atlantic, one of the wealthiest economies today, right? That wealth it is extracted out. And so you can't separate the poverty you see in the underdeveloped world from the wealth that you see in places like Britain. Well, it's ironic that the country that's the most successful in terms of development is China. It's also the country that's had taken the least of the Western prescription for how you develop, right? So China's communist for a bit, then it's heavily state-led, doesn't like interference in its economy, etc. I mean, China is also based heavily on some of these same logics. Its exploitation of its workers, its exploitation of Africa. But I think clearly what has to be said here is that, look, and I always say to people, the worst thing you can do if you live in an undeveloped country is come over to the UK or go over to America and learn about international development. They're literally just trying to, the whole point of that is to teach you into the ways to exploit your economy. There were movements in the 60s, 50s, 60s, kind of in Africa, the Pan-African movement led by people like Kwame Nkrumah, which said actually what we need to do is to take ourselves out of the Western system. You had this whole third world movement. It said, actually, no, we just need to take ourselves out of the system and organize differently. But unfortunately, through violence, through money, through lots of things, that declined. But that's the only way that underdeveloped countries can really develop is to take themselves out of the clutches of the system which is oppressing them. So I think the rise of things like Make America Great Again and Brexit, it just shows you the logics of white supremacy. They're still there. They're still very clearly there. And one of the things that's happened, it's kind of an unintended consequence that if you think about what's happened over the last, since the financial crisis, certainly, but probably earlier, particularly in America and England since Thatcherism, is the same logics that's been applied outside of the West. So they just have this elite that can go and plunder resources, privatization, austerity agenda, all of these things. These are all things that have been enacted on the underdeveloped world for decades. Those are now starting to come back and be enacted in Britain, right? Like privatization is a key one, etc. And so because of that, you're seeing this mass inequality rise again in the West. And how are people here explaining that? They're explaining that through these tropes of white supremacy. The problem is immigrants. The problem is black people. The problem is we need to rally around and defend whiteness in a sense. So these shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody because, as I always say, we haven't really progressed on the issue of racism. It's just shifted shape. And all we're seeing now is a kind of return to some of the older articulations that we saw previously.